Good afternoon, everyone. How can we automate the process of Azure Logic Apps is one of the most common and challenging areas for integration development. In today's talk, Mike will showcase a few techniques and tips that can help you develop real-world solutions that are easier to maintain and develop to a higher quality level. A warm welcome for Mike, who is well known for his interesting technical articles on Azure services.
Hi everybody, sorry I'm trying to resist the temptation to do an Ultimate Warrior run down the aisle there. So great to see everybody again. Thanks everybody who's made it to the last sort of afternoon now. So we're going to talk about automated logic app testing, and I've got loads I want to talk about. I'm pretty sure I won't manage to cover all of it in the time we've got, so there's loads of stuff I've got that people can check out later as well. So I'm going to try and just power in and kind of go through it. Why is my slides not working? Right, so anybody who doesn't know me, hopefully we've met before, but I'm Mike Stephenson, based up in Newcastle. I'm sure everybody from the UK can tell by the accent. I'm a freelance cloud guy. I've done Azure for years and years. Do a bit of blogging, do a bit of kind of MVP type stuff, speaking. Well, we're doing that again now. One of the things I do as well that you might not have come across is this thing called the integration playbook. So as well as blogging, I've tried to create this resource where it's just sharing some of my experiences around my journey in integration. So it talks a bit about different integration technologies, different patterns, what my view on some of the technologies that you should use, some of the ones you should maybe try and be a bit cautious about and stuff. And some of the stuff I'm doing today is talked about in that resource, so if you want to check that out afterwards, and I'd love to hear what you think of it. So what I want to do, I want to really have this session be demo heavy. I'm going to be showing lots of code examples and talking through stuff. I guess as a context setter, I need to talk about why testing is important, but I'm going to kind of try and keep that to a minimum so we can really focus on the key value areas. But that, just to set the scene though, the fact that testing is important, I hope everybody agrees. The reason why it's more important than ever is this theme we've talked about this week about, delivering new value, adding agility to how we deliver stuff means we're delivering more new code into production, more interfaces, and we're doing it fast. But at the same time, while we're doing that, the kind of the opposite reaction to that is that we're building up this risk and we're building up this maintenance overhead. And we need to kind of try and figure out a way to control and reduce that, because the faster we go, the bigger this burden behind us is. It's difficult to kind of, it's going to slow us down. So testing is one of the areas that can help us a lot with that. And that's really what today's all about. This isn't a new topic. It's something people have spoke about in this place for a number of years. So just a quick history lesson. I'm sure people have all come across bits on here before. So in BizTalk world, Kevin Smith years ago created this thing called BizUnit. I'm sure everybody who's worked with BizTalk here has come across BizUnit before. And it was this framework to help you test BizTalk solutions. And then I was really surprised actually looking at the dates of when some of these things happened. So way back in 2012, I started talking about doing BDD and spec flow development with BizTalk as well. And maybe some of you guys have seen me talk or have tried that before. But when we came to Logic Apps in 2017, so Lex and I used to do these Integration Monday sessions before the pandemic sort of made it uninteresting to do online events. We did this Integration Monday where we sort of showed how you could do the same theories but with consumption logic apps, how we could test them in an automated manner. And then one of the guys, I think Shankar, is down in New Zealand. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but he took the demos from there and he created the Logic App Test Manager that we could use to help do that, and that's on NuGet if you're doing consumption. Logic App Standard came out and I wanted to revisit that area and say, right, well, the things that we do with consumption, they work pretty well. Can we do the same with Standard? Because things are a little bit different, and that's really what I want to talk about today. And there's a couple of different approaches I want to go through. But as a general kind of overview, the approach that we want to take when we test a Logic app is we're going to write some code in C#. It's going to trigger a workflow. We're then going to get the run history for that workflow we triggered, and we're going to make some assertions to check certain things happened. Did this action run successfully? Did the workflow complete successfully? And that's really the kind of underlying principle of what we're going to do, and then we're just going to do more and more of that to test this end-to-end workflow. So hopefully in theory it's quite simple, and the kind of samples and the framework will help it make it easy for you to do that. Now, when it comes to Logic App Standard, there's actually two different ways you can do it. So the way that I've kind of covered in the integration playbook is it's very much like what we did with standard. So there's a framework I've put on NuGet, the code's all in GitHub, and the idea is that you deploy a workflow to Azure inside your Logic app, and you can use this code to test that deployed workflow. So you can send a message, trigger it, it'll go and do whatever it does with all your connectors that are deployed, and you test the run histories of it. There's a guy called Henry Liu who's on the product team who produced a sample a few months ago, and he did it a slightly different way, which I think is really interesting because it opens up new ways of doing stuff that you can't really do when it's deployed. So he has a pattern where you basically spin up func.exe, you inject your Logic apps to run locally on your dev machine in it, and then you basically, similar idea, you trigger your workflows and you test what happens. But the big difference between the two is because that sample runs locally, you can actually do some mocking of some of the connectors and stuff like that. So we're going to talk about that as well. And I think, so what I've done is I've included Henry's stuff in the sample we're going to use today. I did have to make some changes to it because I think it needed to be tweaked to run in .NET 6 and VS Code and stuff like that. So kind of just be aware of that. But I've talked about that in the sample. And what I think is really good is these two approaches, you can actually just use them in tandem because they're tackling the problem in a slightly different way. But actually, together they give you a really sort of rounded approach. So you want to test when it's deployed. You might want to test that in your pipelines, for example. You might want to test it in your, with the playbook framework, you could test what's deployed in UAT in an automated fashion. The sample on GitHub from Microsoft's really about, on your dev box, can I do some of this mocking stuff and just test it in isolation. So there's a significant difference about how they work, but together they're really good. So I'm going to focus on the playbook samples first. So I just want to go, each one I'll try and just show a little picture about what we're doing, and then I'm going to jump into the code and walk through some stuff. And really, one of the things I might do, I'll just kind of keep it a bit light on some of the really basic bits because I can just point people to some of the resources which you'll see in the solution if you want to go and check how certain things are done. But the most basic test we're going to do is the picture from earlier. We're going to have some C# code. I've got my Logic app deployed. I'm going to test it and check what happens. So if I jump over into my my machine here, actually just to call a couple of things out, this is what the playbook is. So you'll see there's the standard testing area. And let me see. Right, bear with me a second. I think we might have to jump these. This might be me mucking around with the Okay, so I'll skip the playbook bit. You can check that online. So what we've basically got in GitHub, we've got this solution that I've put together. You guys can all kind of see that okay? Yeah. So it's got a Logic App solution that you'll see at the top here. It's got a whole bunch of different workflows that do, but just sample type stuff, but there's a couple of them that I've tried to make a bit more real world. I've got that deployed in Azure already. And then I've got these two testing projects here. So the acceptance test one's the one where I'm predominantly using the integration playbook framework, testing what's been deployed. And the unit test one, I'm going to use the sample, and I'm going to focus on running it in func.exe locally. So you'll see here, I've got the test framework folders actually where I've put all of Henry's stuff to run it, and the tests themselves are just in here. And then the acceptance test one we'll go through in a bit more detail in a moment. So hello world, if I start in the acceptance test area, so I've got this this kind of echo test here, and if I go into my Azure portal, it's going to do the usual slow run up. I'll just jump ahead there. So we've got basically a really simple simple workflow that's just kind of triggered on an HTTP request, and it pretty much just does a compose and returns a response. Now, what I've done in this acceptance test project is I've added the NuGet package for the test framework. I've added details for a service principal to be able to connect to Azure and run my tests. And then what I'm able to do when I write this test, and this is really just a fairly simple MS test unit test. So I've got my, I'm telling it, here's the name of the workflow I'm going to run. It's just called echo. I'm going to create a test message here. So I'm just going to create a really simple message that's just a key value pair. I'm going to create the JSON for that. And then down here, I'm going to use this Logic App test manager builder. And basically what it does is I'm just going to set some details about the Logic App I'm going to test. And so it knows, if I go to Azure, here's where it is. This is the container it's in. This is the workflow we're going to run. And then down here, I'm going to create this string content. And then if you can see here, I'm going to use the trigger Logic App with post. That basically calls out to my Logic App, and it's going to run it. I'll get back the response once it's finished running, but where the framework really starts coming into its own is on the assertions. So you'll see here I can start doing things like, so I would have got my my response will have a workflow run ID. So if I want to say, what's a good way to check that my workflow actually ran? Well, if I got a successful response and I've got a run ID for it, then I know which Logic App it was out of the 20 or 30 that might have ran. And then with a framework, I can go, load workflow run history, and it'll basically go out to the management API. It'll download the run history for that workflow, and I've now got that inside the framework, and I can start testing what happened. And then what we do further down is we've got these assert methods, so I can basically say, get the workflow run status, and I can say, was that successful? So there's the first test, couple of lines of code, did my workflow, did it return a failure? Did it return, bad gateway or whatever the error code is? Was it a 200, 202, whatever? You can just use the workflow statuses here to check that. And then I can also do things, have I actually got that in this test? Or maybe I haven't. I can also do things, there it is there. Check action status, that was the one I was looking for. So here, I've got this response shape, and we'll just have a look and see if the Azure portal loaded up. There. So this would have been the workflow that ran, and I'm just saying, did that response shape run is the first thing, and what was the result of it when it actually ran? So here I can just do that with get action status and just check it was succeeded. So if you think about when I'm going to test my Logic Apps now, here it's really not that difficult now. I just trigger it and I go, here's the name of the action. Was it successful? And if you do that, you think about all these different branches through your Logic Apps. You know that if I send this message into it, I just go, did that shape run? Did that one run? Yeah, did that one run? I'm pretty confident that it went the path I thought it went, and it was successful. Now, if you compare that, probably one of the most common alternatives that I see is either people trigger it with Postman, or people trigger it from the portal and it runs, and then they're sitting going through the run history, and they're like, ugh. And they're like, yeah, I think that worked. And then they do that again for the other case. And then suddenly when you've got 4 or 5 different ways your Logic App can run, it's like, right, so I now go back and I make a change, and then I have to go run it again. And suddenly it's taking you like 20 minutes to be able to retest all the different scenarios, where we just make a change with this. And I just build up my tests, and I go, right, click run, go and get a coffee, come back. Yeah, my 20 tests have all passed, so I know my Logic App's spot on. And really what we're doing is just more of this approach. And as we go through some of the different scenarios, this is really what it underpins, is this check the actions, check the workflow. Okay, so everybody follow that, okay? Any questions at this point or anything? Yeah, awesome. Yeah. JSON object. So yeah, it's pretty detailed. Yeah, it's what you see. If you go in the portal and you click on the individual shapes, it's all that data there's just coming out as a JSON object, and really the framework's just wrapping that to make it easy to interact with it. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is, sorry, yeah.
What if you have a child
Come on to that in a minute, later on. It's the scenarios, that's way down the line. So the next thing we're going to do is, I mentioned earlier, I talked a lot about BDD and spec flow back in the BizTalk days, and this is one of my favorite things because, when you look at that test we've just looked at, it's really, very code heavy, it's very techy, it's, unless you really know what's going on, you're kind of really digging through this code to understand the process. And one of the things I really liked about SpecFlow, which was introduced to me years ago by a guy called Andy Davis, who was on our team, and he's like, "Oh, you've got to check this out." And I'm like, "Why have I never seen this before?" So SpecFlow adds the idea of you add a layer on top of the code that does the test, and you describe what's happening in easy to understand English, which you'll kind of see on the left of the screen there. So you use this Gherkin syntax, which is common in the BDD world, and you describe a sequence of steps within scenarios. So you might say, I've got my new order process, and the scenarios are given some preconditions happen. When this event happens that triggers something, then these subsequent steps happen. Now, I can sit with somebody who doesn't really understand Logic Apps very well, and I can, it's a great way to work with your BAs, for example. You can sit and understand these steps, document them in SpecFlow, for example, and then what we would do is we'd write code underneath these steps, so you can basically just generate code for each of these steps, and then you just put the code in of what you have to do. So really the it's the same code, it's just structured slightly differently, but you get this layer on top that makes it easy to understand. So one of the things that I find beneficial in the real world is, think how many times you pick up somebody else's BizTalk solution or Logic Apps solution, and you look at the code and you're like, I haven't really got a clue what this does. Where do I start? How, if I'm going to change it, how do I test it to make sure it works and that kind of thing? And having the tests written like this, it's really easy to just get that introduction to what it's doing. So how we do that in the code here, we've got the exact same test. Is VS Code coming up there? Yeah. So you see the folder here is the MS test one. Can everybody read the code okay, by the way, at that magnitude, yeah? So I've got the same test here written in SpecFlow. So you have this feature file where I've got a feature here, and then I have scenarios, and basically each scenario becomes a test. And then inside the scenario, you write these steps here. So you can see I've got given a request to send a message to a Logic app. I've got a couple of sort of frameworky kind of statements here, and the Logic app test manager's up and running, which isn't really a business requirement, but I need it for running the test. But I send the message to the Logic app. It'll start running, receive the message, send a reply, complete successfully, and the message will look like this. That comes back. So, you might not have seen my Logic app. You might not even know that it's a Logic app that does it, but you can understand kind of what that's doing. And then what we do is, in SpecFlow, you would usually have a class that has these binding and these scope kind of elements on them. So what that's saying is that the code in that class can be used by these tests based on either the feature or the scenario is usually a good example. But what's really great is as you build up your library of tests, what you tend to find is a lot of these statements become really common. So the statement of, and the Logic app test manager's running, that's going to be in every test. And I send a message to the Logic app, that's probably going to be in every test. So I can start writing these shared steps that just get executed every time I use that sentence in a Gherkin file. So that's another benefit as you build it up. But what we're actually doing here is as you go through, you'll see there's a kind of a method for every step in that file here. So this one's, I have a request to send a message to the Logic app. So this is really where I'm building my message. So that message in the dictionary I had before, where I just hard-coded it all, I'm actually just specifying the key value pairs here, and I just build that dictionary up, serialize it, and I just save it in that context object so I can use it later on in my test. And then likewise, this one here is the one that sends the message to trigger the Logic app. So you can see here we've got, you might recognize that from the last demo, trigger Logic app with post, calls the Logic app, triggers it, goes and does its stuff. But then as we get further down, we'll look at this get action status. So the Logic app will send a reply. So I'm kind of saying, that response shape, so if we remember that response shape down here in the Logic app, let's check that it actually executed, and let's check what the result was. It was successful, jackpot our test runs. Now, at this point, I'm just going to take a step back from it, so hopefully you guys are following okay. So I want to kind of just show a little bit of VS Code stuff as well, because I'm assuming developing Logic apps in VS Code's fairly new to a few people as well. So in terms of developing the Logic apps in VS Code's one thing, but the actual test experience I think is important to understand as well. So with VS Code, you can kind of run your tests in a couple of ways. So here this is where I've put, you see all these readmes down here. So I made a point, because I knew I was going to talk to you guys about this, of making a lot of notes as I built this solution. So there's a couple of things in here about how did I actually set the machine up for doing this, what things are installed on it. So you'll see here there's a bunch of notes about different bits and pieces. How is the solution set up? What packages did I add? And like one of the things, I'm very much a preferer of proper Visual Studio instead of Visual Studio Code, because I can never remember all the commands. I think I've just reached that point in my life where just being able to, off the top of your head, pull a command out's a bit past me, so I'll kind of miss these menus a little bit. But all of that stuff's really documented in here. And one of the ones you'll see in the testing file, some of the commands for things like .NET test to run a test. There's some examples of running individual tests. So that's all in there as well. And you also have a bunch of extensions. So here's a one where you can do it. So this is kind of the equivalent of the Test Explorer in Visual Studio. And this is one of these extensions that you add, and it'll probably run for a few minutes while it goes and discovers all the tests that I've got. But it'll eventually, I might come back to this in a minute. In fact, there we go. So you can see here that this, you're really going to need this feature, but you can kind of run, you see the Explorer, you go in the test, and I think if I remember right, I'll just show you the debug experience for it, because I think it's quite important. But the one that I always forget to do if I go debug test, so the bit that's really different in VS Code is normally your VS will just kick off, run, hit your breakpoint, and I always sit there and I'm like, what on earth is going on? And eventually I'll remember I need to go into the debug area and I need to attach, and then it'll pop up. And I'll have to remember, and because I've got two projects, it's going to run two test hosts, so I need to remember to pick the right one, which I think is going to be that one. And then I'll go, right, why is it not working? It still hasn't hit my breakpoint. And I'll rip my hair out, and then I'll remember, I haven't touched the code for a couple of weeks, and I'll go, I forgot to press the play button. And then it's going to hit my breakpoint in a second. There you go. So that's the one bit, product team, that's part of why this isn't as good as VS proper for development, because the test experience needs a bit more work. But then here, once you're at this point, you can start, just debugging through like we're used to. So when you get used to those little changes, it starts becoming a bit more what we're familiar with, and we can just step through. So if we see before, that's going, running my Logic app, loads the run history, check check. There's the action just got checked, so we can see the action status here, succeeded. You kind of get the picture. So we're starting to get there. We're starting to introduce stuff we can work with quite effectively here. Now, if we go back to our to our slides here. So we've got the principles. Hopefully you guys are following along quite nicely. It starts opening up opportunities of what we can do. So my next thought is, well, one of the things I always like when I do development, even BizTalk days, if you ever saw me talk about BizTalk Dev, you probably hear me rant on about, I need to be able to test my map before I deploy it to BizTalk, because once it's in the middle of a pipeline or an orchestration, there's like a million other things going on before it gets to my map. So testing the map becomes a real nightmare. So if I can test it in isolation and I know it works before I use it, then it makes my other stuff just much more reliable. So what we did, and we've done this with consumption for a few years, but we're doing this with standard now, is we have some helper logic apps. So one of the things, you can probably kind of do it running it in standard, just running the file for like an XSLT, but and you can maybe do it a little bit for liquid, but I always worry about a couple of things. So one, if I run it locally on the machine, is the setup in either the integration account or on the when it's deployed, is it slightly different in terms of how, what version of the runtime's running it and that kind of thing? I've been bitten by that a few times in the past. So what we usually do is we just put a couple of helper logic apps in, and all they do is you send it a message, it'll run. So we do this for flat file encode, decode, and a few, the XSL transform and the liquid transforms. It just runs that one action and returns the response to you. So, and that's a really easy way to test this. So I just want to kind of show an example of one of those tests in here. Doesn't like coming up this, does it? There we go. Okay, so where are we? So I've got my maps and my schema tests here. Let's look at the map one, for example. So we'll look at this ship instruction map. So the map itself is up in my Logic App artifact folder. So it's a liquid map. So what I'm going to show you in the demo in a few minutes is we're going to have a file comes in. It's in a JSON format. We'll transform it to an XML. Then we'll encode it with a flat file schema to a horrible message that I've used in the real world, same kind of format. But we want to check this map here that'll convert the JSON to the XML. So you can see here I've got, just got this by example XML message. I've got the liquid bits in that pull the data out to create the message. And when my Logic App's deployed, that map's in the Logic App, and I've got my little helper Logic Apps down here that are going to go and deploy with my package. So when I run my test, I can run a Logic App now from a test, so I can just use those helper Logic Apps to run my maps. And what I'll do is I'll have a JSON message here, which represents the input data for the map. And I've got this expected outcome. So if I send this message into the map, I expect to get this XML coming out. So that's quite a simple message. I've just got I've got an example to test here. And all I do is, same as before, let me just pull this down a little bit so I can tell it what workflow I'm going to use. So I'm going to use my test map liquid, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to read these two files from disk, and then I'm going to use trigger Logic App post, sends the message to the Logic App. I'll get my response, and then I just read the content here, and I've got a couple of helper classes just to help do the compares. So I've got my compare XML with XDoc, and it'll basically compare the output XML from the Logic App with this example message on file here. And if they're both good, they match up, jackpot, my map works. And then so one of the things in the real world, some of the maps, they just start having all these different conditions and transforms. Just put more examples in and have more tests, and you can have 10 or 12 tests. Your map's rock solid before it goes anywhere near your workflow. That'll make your life so much easier for complex maps. The principles are exactly the same. Just in the interest of time, I'll skip over the flat file one, but it's exactly the same. The code's just in here, so if you're interested in that, check it out later on. Okay, so we're building up the solution that we're testing. We've got our maps are good. We understand the basics, but what about something a bit more real world? We don't do Hello World very often, except when we're at conferences. So let's imagine we've got this solution here. So this interface is based off a and one I've really built not that long ago. We have a source application, triggers messages out. They come into the integration platform. We end up with a message on service bus. And one of the things, I'll talk about this a little bit later towards the end, but quite often we'll separate the logic of processing the message from something that receives from service bus and triggers a child workflow, starting to come on to Omar's question a little bit. But in this particular example here, I want to focus on that second logic app, which is really where the process that I'm going to implement is, and I'm going to focus on how we test that. So what we'll do is we've got our logic app, we'll build a spec flow test, executes as C#, and it's going to focus on testing that processing logic. And if we have a look, so let me maybe have a look at this one in the portal actually, just to see. So it's going to be this ship instruction processor. How long is this going to take, do we think? There we go. So just to show that it's a little bit more complicated, so there's going to be a JSON event comes into this this logic app. In fact, is it XML, JSON? I can't remember. But either way, I think it might be XML that comes in. But we've got a couple of composed shapes, so I'm going to convert it to JSON. And the first thing I need to decide is, does the event relate to the petrochemical business unit? Because if it doesn't, we want to ignore it and just go on. But if it does relate to that business unit, then we're going to call out over HTTP to a system to get some data. We're then going to run my liquid map that we've just looked at. So this transform JSON to text, so that'll convert the output to the XML format. We're then going to run this flat file encoder. So we use the output from the map, shove it in the encoder, and then we get this really horrible flat file message coming out. And then I think, if I remember right, in the real world, we actually send this over SFTP to a partner. In the demo, I'm just going to return that message as a response. But you guys get the picture. You can do whatever you call an API or something. So if we go and look at our test for that, so we're up here in this features area, and we've got ship instruction, and I've got ship instruction processor. Okay, so the first thing to note is there's loads of extra text on here, and I'm actually going to come back to that in a few scenarios time. So I've actually got extra documentation in this test, and I'll show you why that's really cool later. But the key bits for this are we've got the feature and we've got the scenarios, but this time we've actually got two scenarios. So I've got my green path of what normally happens, and then I've got my ship instruction isn't a petrochemical event, so we ignore it. So I can kind of go down here, and I've got a little bit of text just describing what's going on, but I go, given my request to dispatch an order, and I've got a key value pair of data, that's for the input. So if you're going to drive your tests with some dynamic data, this delivery ID here, you'll see I've just put a little tag so I can replace it with a unique ID, but you can start having like example messages and data in these test cases, and I can, same as before, really, I'm going to trigger, start up the Logic App Test Manager, trigger the Logic App, and then I'm going to check certain things happened. Now, where it starts getting quite cool, I'll go check we looked up data from the source systems. There, I'm going to check that HTTP action happened, the one that I'm saying calls out to the system. But where it starts getting quite interesting, I'm going to go, right, check the Logic App transform the data to the destination format. And this is where I'm going to do something a bit past what we did in the last example. So here, I want to do some checks to say, is there certain things in that XML message that happened, that, what did it look like? Now, but the problem I've got is that how do I see what that XML looked like? Because it's inside the Logic App, so it's not going to be returned or anything. And what we do is inside the test, so we go, where are we? Down here, if we go into the steps, so this test's a bit more complex because we're doing other stuff to set the data up. But one of the things that I've done here, if you see, this is the action for the map. So I've got the name of the action. I'm saying, get the status of that action and then check it's succeeded. So that's exactly what we've already done. But we want to go a bit further, and I can go, right, use the test manager, and I can go, get the action input and get the action output. So if you remember, in the run history, you know, you look in the portal and you always look at the run history, you see the shape and it goes click here to see the message, and then it pops it up in the portal. Well, actually the test can do that as well, because when I get the run history, it actually has the URL to go and get that message. So I can go and get the input and the output messages. Jackpot, I can make my test so much cooler now, because what I do is I go, right, I've got the output message, I load it into an XDoc, and then I can actually, so what I kind of do here is in spec flow, I said, right, I'm not going to go to ridiculous lengths and go and make sure everything about it's spot on. I just want to reduce my risk at this point. So I'll go and check a few of these elements are in, and I can maybe check the value. So that in that test there, I'm saying, you know, just make sure there's an order number element in it, make sure there's a plant ID, and I can go and just test the XDoc and see what was in it. Now, you might want to take it further. Your example, you might want to go and validate it against a schema, check the ID matches the ID you sent. And you can really get creative here about how far you want to take your test. But, you know, we can actually go and check partway through the workflow, what do the data look like for these shapes at this point, which is really powerful. I'm going to come on to this bit here later on, so just kind of make a mental note that we're going to look at this bit later. Now, so here, you know, this test's much more detailed, and when we run it, we'll actually see there'll be two tests show up in the Explorer covering these two cases. So if we open that back up, features. So we see here we've got a couple of tests, and we're going to look at the receiver in a minute, but these are the green path and the non-petrochemical. So I'm just building up this library. You know, my Logic app, it's got two different ways it can go through a condition. We test they both work. Great, you know, we're getting confidence that our workflow is going to run well. Okay, so the next scenario starts really touching on Omar's scenario a bit about child workflows and things like the other question I get is, well, what if it's not triggered by HTTP? That, you know, like being able to test it over HTTP is the easy bit, but what if it's triggered by a queue? You know, we had this before. Actually, my diagram's wrong there now that I look at it. The box should be one to the left. So we're going to look at that Polar Logic app now, and we're going to focus on how can I test that. So that's triggered by Service Bus. But the problem is if I write a message to Service Bus, it's going to trigger the Logic app, but I didn't trigger it myself. So how do I know which Logic app kind of ran? You know, let's say there's 2 or 3 messages. So that's one of the problems. I need to get the run history for that Logic app. Now, there's a couple of ways you can do that. The way, like the sort of cheap and easy way, I guess, is what I've done here, but I just want to talk a little bit about other ways as well. So that, there we go. Okay, so let's have a look at the receiver. So again, we've got a bit of documentation in here. The ship instruction receiver green path. It's a bit like the other test, but the key lines that are different are, instead of when I call the Logic app, I've got when I send a message to the service bus. So the code under the hood is going to write a message to service bus, and then I've got and I'll wait a short period of time, because actually I don't control the trigger. I need to wait for however long it's going to take to trigger it. So if you've got like a really quick recurrence, it might trigger pretty much straight away, but you may have a longer one. And then what I'm doing here is I'm going, right, in this case, the easy way is, especially if you're testing on your dev box or something, is I check for the most recent run. So what I can do here is just in the steps, and we'll see, got the message is the same as before, but here's the one when I send it to Service Bus. So the couple of key points to note are, where did I do this? Here, my custom properties. So I sent when I send the message to Service Bus, I put a custom property of a delivery ID on that message that I save in my test, because I want to use that later on for something that I think is quite important to do. And I'm going to send that to Service Bus with a helper here. So, you know, this is just the Service Bus framework. Point to a queue, send the message, and then I just wait. And you can see that the wait's just asleep. But the most recent run of the Logic app, I can just use the framework and go, well, you know the name of my Logic app, so give me the most recent run since whatever time I started, so I can, I can kind of change the time and stuff if I want to and that. But it's the same as before. All I'm doing is I'm identifying which run in the runs I want to look at. I then load the history for that run. And if I maybe wait to give it a chance to finish executing or something, or I can refresh the run history if I want to check if anything else has changed. But the one bit that I want to do after that, so here I'll go, and the Logic app will track the delivery ID, right? So this is quite a good little bit here. So I've sent the message to the service bus. It's got a property on it. In my Logic app, I've set a tracked property. So I'm just in the interest of time, I'll not show this in the Logic app itself, but I've set a tracked property on a compose action that gets that delivery ID and has it as a tracked property. So what I'm able to do here is I can say, right, when I got that action, in fact, I think I might have done it on a variable. So I'm going, get the JSON for the initialized variable for the delivery ID, and I can get its tracked properties. And I probably could have got its value as well, maybe if I've done it with a variable, but if it was on like a parse JSON or something, you might want to make your life easier with a property. So I can say that action should have a tracked property called delivery ID. I can then test that ID is the same as the one that I put on the service bus message that I sent in the first place. So again, jackpot, we know we've got the right run instance. We're processing the message. That's the one I expected. And then the rest of the tests are very similar to after that. I guess come back to the earlier question, the one bit I'm doing here is because I receive from service bus, then call the child logic app. I've just got this get action status to say, I called the child logic app processor, that kind of line here, and I just check it was successful. Now, I'm going to talk about this in the tips at the end, but one of the things that I think is really good about this approach of breaking them up is I can focus in this logic app on saying, did the receive work, did that basic bit of logic to just get the message and start processing it and track it. And I can kind of not care that much about the child logic app. I could kind of say, I might not even put that in. I might just say, as long as that gets to the end of the logic app, I'm happy. And I can focus a much more complicated set of tests on the logic of actually the complex workflow. And I think that separation of how to do that's a good approach to take. Okay, so next up, we're going to talk about the next problem of mocking with the unit test sample. So, I've talked to a few people this week about some of the approaches people are taking in the real world. There's some good features and that, but there's always been like bits of hassle around how do I, the core underlying problem is I've got my Logic app deployed in Azure. It talks to Dropbox, Twitter, and something else. I don't have control over those systems, so I'm really having to put a message in that'll trigger the right response from different people to test my scenario I want to test, and that becomes challenging when you don't control what systems are going to respond with. So people use different approaches. You've got the mock response feature in Logic Apps where you can turn on certain actions will give you a hard-coded response. You see people who sometimes do, I'll call API management and I'll just use a sample mock response from there. Omar had a quite interesting, when we talked about this earlier, had a quite interesting approach of swapping the Logic app names sometimes, so you'll have certain ones will have certain responses, and they all come with quite a bit of overhead to do those because you have to, it's really a deployment effect and change where you want to do certain things, so it becomes quite challenging to do, and this is where Henry did this great job with this sample. So how he did it was when you run Logic apps on your dev machine in VS Code, you can run them in the func runtime. So I'm assuming people have probably seen this a little bit before, but you run it, func.exe spins up, it loads all of your Logic apps in it, and you can run them locally. And that was one of the big wins for the dev experience of Logic Apps Standard. And in the sample we're going to look at, what we do is basically my unit test's going to spin up func.exe, load the Logic apps in it, and then the Logic app's going to call out a Dataverse, just for an example. And I'm going to call the who am I method that just responds back and says, your Mike or your whatever the name of your service principal is, if depending on how you've configured the connection. And in the sample, I've got this same scenario I've got running with a SpecFlow example in the acceptance test where it does it deploy to Azure. And I've also got a sample where we're going to do exactly this of run it in func.exe locally. And what I had to do, so Henry's code samples about runs in normal VS, and I had to upgrade it to .NET 6 to work in my sample. And I also had a little bit of hassle with how he returned the mock responses when it updated to .NET 6. So what I did is I actually modified it a little bit and put something called wiremock, which is a NuGet thing that you can add. And it actually just makes it really easy to put your sample responses in. So I'm going to show that quickly. And I know we're kind of not got that long left, so I'll just rush a little bit, I think. So we're down in these unit test projects, and the frameworks here, and the bit I've really changed on it is this mock host 2. I've just turned the original one into a markup file so you can see it, but this one basically adds wiremock inside here. And I've got this Dataverse Who Am I test, and there's basically, using Henry's sample, it's very similar to how we've done it with a playbook sample, where and actually what I did as well, I put a couple of wrapper classes on just to make these a little bit easier to use, but basically you've got the same principle. You set up your workflow, you get the callback ID, you can do a post to your Logic app, and then you can check the actions and stuff like that. And so hopefully when you see that code, that's fairly similar to what we've looked at previously. But with mocking, the bit that gets really quite cool is here. What I'm doing here in this other test is I've got the response that I want Dataverse to give me back. So I know, I've ran this in Postman before. I know what the response Dataverse gives. It's a simple JSON object with a couple of properties on it. Here I've got the input message that I'm going to use to trigger my Logic app. And what we do is, so with a framework sample from Microsoft, what you have to do is when you've got like a helper class that will spin up func.exe for you, it's very similar to how people can do automated tests for functions. And what you do that's different though is you basically say, here's the list of workflows that I want you to load into my func.exe when it's running. So you've got a lot of flexibility to say, you can either just load it all once, run all your functions in it, all your workflows in it, and just test all that. But with each test, you've got the option to spin it up again and change the workflows or configure which ones are actually running, which gives you that power to be able to do this mocking approach. So I can load my Dataverse Who Am I workflow in. And one of the things that I can do here is it'll automatically load a host.json and an app settings into the func.exe as well. And what I'm doing with these lines of code here is I actually get the app settings, and I can go and change, even though I've configured my Logic app in the designer and everything to point to Dataverse, I'm going, instead of that, go and change the URL for Dataverse to point to my mock server, which my test's going to spin up in a minute. And that'll mean when I run my Logic app in func.exe, it's going to call out, but it'll redirect back locally, and I'll be able to give it the response that I want, not the Dataverse one. And then here, when I run my test, so I basically say, start up my mock HTTP server on port 7075. I've got an HTTP client for triggering the Logic app, and this one here is the test host that we've got running the framework. And then with wiremock, I basically say, if I get a response that hits the mock server on that path using the get method, I want you to give it 200, and I want you to use that mock response we created a few lines higher up. So it's that easy with just a couple of lines of code to tell it that's the response I want for this test. And then I might have another test where I give it an error response or a something else. And if you think when you get your complex Logic apps, you can have loads of different scenarios going on. And then after that, the rest of it's just the same. It's just we trigger it, we test the actions, and then at the end, I think I can do something where I check the response I got was actually instead of being my service principal ID, if it ran in Azure, it might be just the mock GUID that I put in on the test, so we can really powerfully mock here. Okay, so next up, we've got pipelines. So we've had quite a few DevOps sessions this week. I need to be able to run my tests in a pipeline. So it's really important if we're going to do this rich CI/CD experience. So I've got in the solution sample pipeline. I run the two types of tests. So you'll see in the top corner, build, package, and run unit tests versus deploy to dev and run acceptance tests. They're the two different flavors. In the code, you'll see we've got up at the top here, we've got the pipelines folder, and we've got a YAML file that does those two sets, and basically it's everything you need to be able to run them all in here. I'll let you guys, in the interest of time, I'll let you guys look at this in your own time. The couple of bits that I will say about it is, I've split the stages, and you'll see that there's a few diagnostic steps I usually find help people have easier to maintain pipelines, but the key bits for the deploy to Azure is we use the out-of-the-box function deploy to deploy the Logic app, and then we just run the unit tests. I'll come back to the spec flow thing in a minute, but we just run them, and it's very much like I was shown before. But the bit with the Microsoft sample framework, there's a lot more work to get it to run in a pipeline, because you need to deploy Azure right to your build agent, you need to deploy the function runtime, you need all the prerequisites, get that all running, and then you run your .NET test and it'll spin it all up. So you need all those extra bits at the start. I'm just using the cloud hosted one, but you could do a custom agent and take some of that out a little bit. I wouldn't mind just showing you guys. So you can see in the pipeline here. Is that going to come up? So you can see here's the steps that it actually ran in the pipeline. So you can see we've got, npm to install Azure right, blah, blah, blah. There's loads of different bits you need to do. And then the deploy to Azure, you can just see it's a bit of a simpler job to run. So, that's the pros and cons of the two approaches. And the good thing is you can also publish your test results to DevOps at the end. So you can see, here's my acceptance tests. There's the summary, there's the individual test results, and I can go into them, and all the good things you can just do out the box with a testing on .NET and stuff. Okay, so I think last bit, hopefully. So I want to show one more thing, and then we'll kind of wrap up. So the bit where I think, or my latest cool thing I like doing is this thing called Living Documents. So it's the thing that comes with SpecFlow. And I think, hopefully if you've followed my journey, we've gone from having either no tests or very limited tests to having some good quality tests. We're making our code easier to maintain. We can work better as a team. But now we want to add documentation and turn our tests into executable documentation that reduces our overhead over time. And what I can do with Living Document is I can take those SpecFlow files, I can flush them out with a bit more details and examples and all that stuff, and I can have it generate documentation that I can load into DevOps, or I can load it out. I've also got a thing where I can load it into SharePoint. Now, if you notice, when we look back over here, if I go to my rich acceptance test. Right, so here we've got, I mentioned it a little bit before, but I put a lot of notes in here about what's going on. So I said, well, not just as a so that then I can say, well, this is what it actually does. I can add a link to some diagrams. You've got, good markup support here. And you've also got these tags you can put on. So that's actually a tag that points to a work item in DevOps. So I can actually link out to requirements that I've used to, so maybe I had a requirement to build the interface, and then later on they come along and go, oh, well, we need it to do this now. And I'll go, right, well, here's a new test for this new thing. Let's link to the requirement that told us to do that. And then what that means is that when I run my tests, SpecFlow generates this file. And in my build pipeline, which I think I might have on my other screen. So in my build pipeline, I run this SpecFlow step here that's after my test, and it basically goes and adds that documentation to DevOps over here. So I've added a SpecFlow extension. Now, if you're not a developer and you're a BA or you're somebody who's in the support team, you can go into either DevOps or SharePoint, wherever you've put your files, and I can go, right, well, let's look at the ship instruction one. So I drag this across a bit and I can go, well, here's my spec flow file. It's got my bit of documentation here at the top. I can click, that's the link for the hyperlink for more information. I can go, well, I've got my links here, so I can go open that tag, and that goes and opens up, if it logs in, it'll open up the work item link, so I can go and read all the documentation from the requirements. You see that loaded up there. And then the other bit that I kind of showed very loosely these examples where I had a couple of lines of code after I'd read the action results, and I said, add that to the login. And what Living Document does is I'll actually have, if you see here, I'm going down the documentation, the little ticks tell me whether they passed or failed in the test. And then suddenly I've got my log messages. So this here is the sample message that triggered the Logic app. And if we go a bit further down, I've got the example message that the Logic app read from the external system when we got the data. And then further down, we'll have, here's the flat file horrible message that I told you about a couple of times. So I've injected these sample messages that I've used in my tests into my documentation that a BA can go and read and now understand about my Logic app. And hey, how cool do we look on our team now? We've got all this. I can see Ricardo smiling, so I know I'm doing well. Yeah, it's pretty cool, and I can share that documentation with other people who aren't developers, and they understand how the interfaces work and they can see examples. Okay, so let's wrap up a bit then. So top tips. So firstly, do testing, do automated testing. Hopefully you've really kind of saw the benefits of it here, but build testable workflows. So the hardest ones I come across is where we get a Logic app and it's got like a loop and there's a million things in the loop. That makes it hard to test. So when it starts getting complicated, break some of that out into a child workflow, test the child workflow, test the parent. You're making it, there might be a little bit of performance overhead on it, possibly, so you need to balance the trade-offs, but actually maintainable software over a long period of time, that's really what you want. So it's, making that testable is a good thing, particularly loops, particularly conditions. The number of times you say, oh, well, there's not just a loop, but there's like a condition, then there's another condition, then there's another one. And these all, if there's one shape or something, it's not that bad, but suddenly you get like 50 shapes in each one. And it's like, I remember Nino's horrible orchestration picture years ago at one of the integrators. It's like, oh my God, how do I test that? Define your requirements as tests. So all of this spec flow stuff, you could work with your BA to help write the requirements as tests and then just write the code behind them. Do it from day one. And the best tip, it's not about being perfect. It's about reducing risk so that you can improve your agility. That's really the takeaway. And we'll wrap up, I think, with what's good. So we can do all the testing we could already do in Logic Apps. I've added some more cool features to it. What needs work, Microsoft guys, the whole Visual Studio thing, please sort that out because VS testing is so much better than VS Code testing. Bit more guidance on the mock testing, I think, would help people. So I did mocked an HTTP call. Henry's examples have where he's mocking an API connector, so you should be able to do that as well. I haven't managed to have time to do that for a demo for today, but I think you should be able to do it because you're just changing what the Logic app files are using as the URL, so you should be able to mock them out, and hopefully I'll get a chance to do that. It'd be quite cool to mock out things like your Dropbox connectors and your SharePoint connectors and stuff. There's a whole bunch of links to documents with more info about it. I'm probably going to do some like little nugget videos just to show some of the tips to help people get started. But hopefully, you're all going to go away and can make life a bit easier for everybody at work. That's really my aim today. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the session. Questions, please come and give me a shout. I think I've probably been a bit naughty and went a bit over, but I'll apologise to Alessandro, but I think you should just keep going when you get started. Thanks very much for listening.
Covey.co